Hey everyone, so this is a video lecture on Tocqueville and Horace Mann, and it's designed really to kind of get us back on track because of the class cancellation and to make sure that by the midterm we get up to the point where all the material that would be covered on the midterm we've covered in class. So I'll record this video lecture. You can kind of watch it at your own leisure, and it will get us back on track. So today we're going to talk about another variant of civic republicanism. We're kind of taking it out of Rousseau's hands and starting to look at more practical perspectives from the early American Republic, specifically the United States in the 19th century. And we're talking about somebody who you might have encountered in other classes, Alexis de Tocqueville. The context in which we read de Tocqueville is really more in terms of his political thought and what he's saying about civic associations and the ways in which the American polity, the state, is really dependent upon these forms of association and interaction that are happening. And it's one of the things that he finds so remarkable about the United States when he comes here to visit. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about Horace Mann, who is an educational leader, one of the early educational leaders in the United States, and in many ways is responsible for the system of public education that we have in the United States today. So oftentimes you'll go to university campuses or you'll see schools that are named after Horace Mann. That's because of his role in really shaping the American philosophy on public education here in the United States. So we're going to talk about Alexis de Tocqueville, his mission, his goal in the United States, and a little bit about his historical context. We'll talk about the purpose of democracy in America. His most famous work comes in 2 volumes, and whether or not his insights capture the spirit of American democracy. In essence, how good of a job did he do in analyzing and trying to understand the early American Republic? And then we shift gears a little bit to Horace Mann, who shares some commonalities with Alexis de Tocqueville, but is really more focused on the education piece. And so we'll talk about the relationship between education and democracy that he sees. So to start, we'll talk about Tocqueville and his context. There is Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French aristocrat. He was a civil servant. He was part of the kind of the landed upper classes in France, and came over to the United States to learn more about this strange, novel, innovative American experiment in democracy and see what he could learn. So initially he was sent to study American penitentiaries. I always use the example of Hunter S. Thompson. He's kind of like Hunter S. Thompson in the sense that if you've read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, you know that he's sent on a more or less conventional journalistic assignment to cover a motorcycle race, and he ends up writing something completely different and way off topic. He kind of goes rogue. Tocqueville is not as experimental or strange as Hunter S. Thompson, but he is veering pretty far from what his assigned responsibility was, in that he was sent to study the American correction system and bring back insights and reforms for the Europeans, and instead he was much more interested in studying American political culture. What would he have been looking at? Well, Tocqueville's America in the 1830s or so was much less stratified by class than 19th century Europe, both in terms of economic class, so just how much wealth people have, what they own, but also the social attachments to class, right? The social expectations that emerged out of one's class standing. In Europe, you had something much closer to a caste system in which there were rigid divides between, the elites and the less well-off, and you don't have that in the United States. He would have encountered a much more participatory culture politically than in Europe, at least in the Northeast. And we're going to talk about his path and where he spent time. And so I'll suggest that he got kind of a partial picture of the United States. And also, Tocqueville's America would have been interesting and distinct to him because there was this ethic of hard work, which I think we still have today. That hard work is something valuable. Hard work is something that we should strive towards. There's a virtue in hard work, and it should be valued and respected. Whereas in Europe, it would have really been looked down upon. At least within Tocqueville's social class, it would have been looked down upon. To work hard meant that you were part of an underclass and you were not part of this elite. Keep in mind that we just had the French Revolution in the late 18th century. These were themes that we talked about when we discussed Rousseau. And so Tocqueville is going to carry with him some of that class sensibility from old Europe. So a question to ask is so what? Why does Tocqueville even care about what's going on in the United States? If he's sent here to study American prisons and penitentiaries, why is he so interested in American political culture? And the answer is really that he sees what's happening in the United States as a harbinger of what's to come in Europe. And we'll talk more about this in a second. But he really thinks that the broader trends of equality and the de-stratification of society according to wealth and income and social standing and social class, all of that is eventually going to come to Europe as well. And he's right in that respect. It would happen later, and we still see vestiges in Europe of these rigid class distinctions, but that American ethic of equality is eventually going to extend over across the pond to Europe. Some have criticized Tocqueville's journey, and we'll look at his actual path on a map in just one sec, but some have said that he didn't really capture the diversity of American political life. Alan Ryan, who's a political theorist who has edited some collections of Tocqueville's work and written quite a bit about Tocqueville, said that Tocqueville and his companion, Gustave Beaumont, saw next to nothing of the real South, and that his work could have just as easily been called Democracy in Yankee America. Particularly what Ryan is criticizing is that he didn't really see, the slavery. He never was exposed in any great for any great period of time to the slave economy in the South and the rigid social distinctions that were partially based on race. There was, the racial distinction in which that essentially defined whether or not you were human or property in the South. But there was also pretty rigid social distinctions and forms of life, socioeconomic status and class relations that more closely mirrored what we saw in Europe than what we would see in the bustling Northeast. So that's a criticism of Alan Ryan, and many other thinkers have made that criticism. You can see actually in Tocqueville's journey, so this is the route that he took. He landed in Newport, Rhode Island, which if you've been to Newport, Rhode Island, you know that this was a very wealthy area and that there are mansions and wealthy families. And so he really liked Newport when he landed. He was really excited to get started and explore the United States. And so he spent a little bit of time in Newport, but then eventually traveled all the way down through the South, spent some time in New Orleans. The areas marked in blue would be areas in which he spent a significant period of time. Traveled up through Tennessee and Kentucky, Ohio, and eventually back through New England, up almost all the way to Quebec there, and out through to the Great Lakes. But keep in mind where those blue dots are, right? He saw New Orleans, which New Orleans is culturally distinct in many ways from what's happening in the rest of the Deep South. And then the areas in which he spent a lot of time were New York, Philadelphia, and Massachusetts. And so the bulk of his time really was spent in the Mid-Atlantic or New England. And so he saw a lot of Yankee America. He didn't necessarily spend a lot of time in the Deep South. And perhaps that colored or characterized his perceptions of the United States and its political system, its class system, in ways that weren't quite wedded to reality. Just a little note, one thing that Tocqueville never said in any of his works, but he's constantly quoted as saying this. Some politicians will say, America is great because America is good. If America ever ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. He never said that. that was someone else, perhaps writing about Tocqueville, but numerous politicians on the campaign trail, former presidents, have attributed that quote to Alexis de Tocqueville, and there's no evidence that he ever said that. He was pretty mixed. He was pretty ambivalent about what he saw in the United States and had pretty mixed feelings about the American experiment. And that quote, I think, is a little too optimistic for Tocqueville. So let's talk a little bit about his major work, Democracy in America. You see here his notes, his original notes from his travels through the United States that eventually would be compiled. And Democracy in America it's a sweeping work, as I said, in 2 volumes. Most people read the first volume and don't read the second volume, but it's pretty significant and takes on really all sorts of different aspects of American life. It is ostensibly about democracy and political life, but it goes much broader than that. So one of the things that he's grappling with here, and you read about it in your selections, is this inevitable rising tide of equality. The U.S., he thinks, enjoys a unique degree of prosperity, largely because of its origins. There's some things that characterize the American experience that he thinks set it up in ways that lead to prosperity, widespread prosperity, not just prosperity localized in some wealthy families or a handful of individuals. The first is that it is free from the aristocratic tradition. So there is not an aristocracy. There is not a landed elite. There was never any sort of process of feudalism and landlords holding huge, vast tracts of land and having individuals essentially pay patronage to them in order to subsist off of that land. That doesn't exist, right? This is a frontier society. Admittedly, it's a frontier society that takes the native and indigenous populations and pushes them west and engages in genocidal relocation of those populations. But the European population that has settled here does not establish anything remotely close to feudalism or an aristocracy. And so the prospect of the creation of an underclass wasn't realistic. The frontier conditions were such that everyone had to work really, really hard. Everybody had to be industrious. They were settling land that, while they were occupants, right, they were indigenous populations, they wanted to remake it in the image of Europe. And so they would have to work really hard in order to build cities and build infrastructure and build ports and just kind of establish something similar to what they had left in Europe. And so everybody had to work really hard to do that. There was no room for there to be an underclass that was, toiling away, and then an idle class. Now, here's an area in which you could look at the South, for instance, right, and the institution of slavery. But even among slave owners, there wasn't hard work was not it was not denigrated. They owned slaves, but they were also working, right? They weren't simply subsisting on the labor of their slaves. So there wasn't this society-wide aversion to hard work in the way that there was in Europe. And that leads to a different culture. It leads to a different mentality about the nature of work. It's also free from the threat of foreign invasion due to its unique geography. It says, America is the only country in which it has been possible to witness the natural and tranquil growth of society, which again, if you think about the origins of the United States, the fact that so many were displaced and killed, the indigenous populations, or the institution of slavery, you wonder how natural and how tranquil was it. But what he meant was there wasn't this process of foreign invasion and just decades of war to establish the modern boundaries. Europe, its history pretty much through to the modern period was one of constant warfare, even into the contemporary period, right up into the 20th century. Constant warfare, really devastating warfare between nations. And he is saying that America, because of its unique geography, has been spared that. So it's been able to grow organically and develop in ways that Europe never was. And Tocqueville thinks that this is coming in Europe, right? That this equality that exists between individuals and this lack of a rigid stratification of the different classes is pretty soon going to be the condition in Europe. He says, the noble has gone down the social ladder and the roturier has gone up. The one descends as the other rises. Every half century brings them nearer to each other and they will very shortly meet. So yes, there is some, distinction between those at the top, the nobility, and those at the bottom, but they're getting closer and closer. And every few decades, they get closer still, and eventually they're going to meet. There's going to be some sort of formal equality, and these distinctions between the upper class and the lower classes won't really exist, that's an idealistic sentiment, and we've never really seen a perfectly equal society, but at least in terms of formal equality, right? We can talk about like political citizenship and the idea that there aren't different statuses for different types of people, at least formally and legally, that we all share a common political identity and share the same rights and protections of those rights in a formal sense. He's right. And at least at this time, the distribution of wealth, the distribution of society's resources would have been much more equal in the United States than it was in Europe, even though already by the 19th century, we're starting to see stratification on the basis of wealth, and we're starting to see pretty distinct inequality emerge. So that's what brings him here, right? That's what he's really taken with in the American societies. He thinks he sees some vision of what the future is going to be in Europe. How does he feel about this? Ask yourself that, maybe pause this and mull it over for a little bit, how you think Tocqueville feels about the rising tide of equality. I think that it's a mistake to read him as a fan, a cheerleader for this rising tide of equality. If you read closely what he says about the inevitability of this and the fact that this is coming to Europe, he's not celebrating it. He thinks that there's lots of problems potentially with this rising equality. So let's talk first about the positive aspects of equality. He spends some time on this. He says all citizens will enjoy greater prosperity. He's already seeing this in the American society, right? The condition of the poor in the United States is not anything like the condition of the poor and the underclass in Europe. There's this general equality of condition in early America that simply astounds him. He's not seeing people living in the street in rags. Even those who are less well off are industrious and working and making money. And there's forms of societal charity and philanthropy to protect those who aren't able to work. So the general equality of condition is much. There's a much more equal society in the United States than what he's used to in Europe. There's also less extreme deprivation, right? So there's fewer people that are starving. There's fewer people that are out in the street in rags. There's greater social mobility. People are able to come to the United States at this point with nothing or very little, and through hard work, they're able to improve their position. And so you have people that through education, through learning a trade, through making wise decisions, build pretty comfortable lives for themselves in ways that wouldn't have been possible in Europe. They wouldn't have had that social mobility. They wouldn't have been able to transcend and leap across class barriers in the way that they can in the United States. And he thinks that because of this, there can also be greater social stability. So keep in mind that France, roughly 50 years before, had undergone what was essentially a social and economic revolution. What was driving people into the streets was the fact that there was this tremendous inequality and that people were suffering, and the social system, the political system, was doing nothing to protect them. But he thought in a more equal society, there would be less division, and there would be less tendency to see those divisions explode violently as they had in Europe. But it's not all positive, right? There are some positive elements, but that's only part of it. And so when we look at Tocqueville and we focus only on those things that he views to be largely positive, we miss a big piece of Tocqueville. There's a big piece of Tocqueville that is traditionally European, and is somewhat appalled and disgusted by what he's seeing in the United States, and views it fearfully, views it as something that, though inevitable and though it will come to Europe, is problematic, and something important will be lost. So what is he not so excited about? What is he a little upset about? Well, he thinks that nations as a whole will be less brilliant, less glorious, less strong. He does believe in a natural hierarchy. He believes that there are some individuals that are better than others. And under conditions of equality, under conditions in which they're not allowed to flourish and be an elite, and in which society as a whole is kind of skeptical and distrustful of elites, then they won't be able to achieve their greatness. He thinks that the aristocratic system of privilege that he sees in France and other places in Europe allows for a class of individuals to become refined and culturally advanced in ways that aren't possible in America. He views the American society as prosperous and hardworking and industrious, but kind of a cultural wasteland. He's very typically French in that sense. I think you still encounter this a little bit, in which those from countries that really take pride in their culture look at the United States and see someplace that's not that interesting culturally, that's not doing a lot in the form of high culture, art, literature, poetry, performance, those sorts of things. And he thinks that the aristocratic system of privilege, whereby some people just don't have to work, they're independently wealthy and there's no expectation for them to work, it allows people to achieve that refinement. He's also deeply concerned about our doctrine of self-interest. He's looking at basically the United States at the outset of the Industrial Revolution. He's starting to see big business and industrialists who make money, make vast fortunes very, very quickly, and aren't incredibly refined, don't have any sense of like what they need to give back to society. They're content simply to make money for themselves and then kind of squirrel away that money for themselves and their families. He sees a decline of and an assault on religion, which he thinks is an important unifying and kind of refining force in society. It pulls people together, and it also gives them a sense of something beyond themselves, something bigger than the individual. And in ways similar to Mill, he's fearful of the state of mass opinion. He sees an American society that is gripped by license, that's not restrained in any way. Nothing is off limits. Nothing is forbidden. Nothing is taboo. So American cities are filled with hard drinking people with loose morals, in which there's no sort of refinement. There's no sense of what is moral or proper. And that lack of propriety, that lack of morality is deeply troubling. He doesn't see how that can lead to a society that ultimately aspires to be something greater, aspires to be something bigger than simply individual self-interest. And he also thinks that this individualistic system can lead to a loss of identity. The French system, even though it's stratified, even though it's limiting for individuals, there's a great pride in being French and a sense that you know who you are as a French person. And in the United States, he sees lots of individuals that are just kind of rootless, nomads. They don't have a sense of identity. They don't belong to something larger. They exist to make money and maybe provide for their family, but there's not a strong sense of what it means to be an American. And in those conditions, individuals can feel superfluous. They feel unnecessary. They feel unattached, not part of something larger. The political theorist Alan Ryan, that we talked about at the outset, in commenting on Tocqueville, discusses this. He says that Tocqueville feared that the individualism of Americans would lead not to each individual being able to think for himself and to carve out his or her own view of the world, but to a desperate isolation. Lost in the crowd of other individuals, we run the risk of having no sense of belonging other than to our family, and of becoming absolutely dependent on the government and public opinion for emotional and intellectual support. So we simply do what the government tells us, or we just absorb kind of unthinkingly the mass opinion, which may be enlightened, but oftentimes is not, right? It's just kind of the lowest common denominator. And so there wasn't all of these things that we talk about when we talk about how individualistic American society is, Tocqueville didn't see this as leading to, leaders, people who would think for themselves and be independent and autonomous. He saw this as individuals who are rootless and wandering around and would just attach themselves to larger ideas without questioning them. Some of these ideas later would be used to explain the rise of authoritarian movements in the mid-20th century and the rise of fascism in Europe. A lot of the people that were attracted to the Mussolinis and the Hitlers of the world did so because they felt like they didn't belong to anything, and they just wanted to belong to something, to have a sense of identity and a sense of pride in something. And so Tocqueville is diagnosing some of these very modern fears of isolation in the mid-19th century, saying that there is this part of the American culture that leaves us vulnerable in this way. So how do we deal with those threats? How do we ensure that those dangers in this new and really profound political experiment don't overwhelm society? Tocqueville suggests some ways in which we counter them. The first is to educate the democracy, to educate citizens. This is where we see Tocqueville at his most civic Republican. I think sometimes he seems very liberal, but in other points he seems pretty much in line with some of the things that Rousseau is saying. How do we deal with these threats? He says to educate the democracy, to warm its faith, if that be possible, to substitute a knowledge of business for its inexperience and an acquaintance with its true interests for its blind propensities. So we make individuals think in terms of an enlarged mentality, not their self-interest, but something larger than themselves. And there's a number of ways in which we can do that. One is religion. Tocqueville is another one of these civic Republicans that thinks there is an instrumental value for religion, and it can be very useful in overcoming the individualistic impulses that liberal democratic systems can set up. He also talks about education, and we're going to get into more of this with Horace Mann, but he thinks education, really from a fundamental young age, is important to tame some of these distempers associated with liberal democracy. And he also thinks that civic associations, or what we today call civil society, are very important. And this is really what we take from Tocqueville. The vast majority of political scientists who invoke Tocqueville are invoking his thoughts on the importance of civic associations and these forms of interaction that are not economic in nature and they're not driven by the government. They're voluntary actions, voluntary forms of engagement with fellow citizens in communal life. And that's what Tocqueville is really struck by in the United States. So many previous thinkers had looked at these civic associations somewhat fearfully. If you go back to Madison, who we read, this would be a form of faction. This would be something that institutions have to control and temper, because it's very easy for these forms of associations to become factions that would undermine the American institutions and undermine the forms of compromise and interaction that have to happen in a complex democracy. But Tocqueville sees them as productive, and he sees them as positive. He's struck by the scope of voluntary association in the United States. There's simply nothing like it in Europe. He hasn't seen anything like this. He says, in America, the liberty of association for public purposes is unbounded. And he really sees these associations as kind of an on-the-job training for democracy. They play an educational role. So engaging in a civic association, we could think of them in a contemporary sense, like a student group, being part of a community organization, even things like participating in a soccer league or a parent-teachers association, being part of some sort of voluntary group, some sort of service group. These are like training for democracy. You have the core freedoms of democracy. You have a freedom of opinion, freedom of association. Usually there'll be some sort of decision-making structure in which individuals have to vote, and they tend to be pragmatic and centrist in the United States. We don't see a lot of radical groups emerge in the United States. This is different than what's happening in Europe. In Europe, the forms of association that emerge often are very radical, and they have a greater likelihood to engage in violence. So Tocqueville is looking at this and saying these sorts of associations are much better in terms of preparing people for democracy. The associations and the forms of connection that we see in Europe are much more dangerous. I think primarily what he would have been kind of freaked out by was the rise of modern labor unions, which we've had some radical labor unions in the United States, but in Europe, radical labor unions, anarchist groups, revolutionary anti-government and anti-capitalist forces, they were a much more serious threat than they've ever been here. And so they would emerge and take a confrontational tone with capitalist institutions, major businesses, the government. They also tended to be way more centralized and hierarchical. So there wasn't this realm for broad-based decision-making. There was usually a pretty rigid leadership structure, and it was very top-down. The people at the bottom didn't have a lot of control over what these associations were doing. So Tocqueville views this positively. For these associations to play a positive role, for them to actually contribute to democracy rather than undermine it, he argues that they have to embody a form of unity. They bring people together, but they don't fuse them together, right? So you think of organizations that you're involved in, you retain your individuality. You retain your ability to act as an individual. You're not forced to swallow a dogma or a certain way of thinking. You can express disagreement with leadership. You can express disagreement with your fellow members. There's not an emphasis on uniformity in terms of one's ideas. And in that sense, these associations become a setting in which we exercise our reason, not our obedience. We have to make arguments for the things we want to see happen. We have to make the better case, try to persuade people, as opposed to being an exercise in how well can you obey the leader. And we also need to be less rigid than the European model of political association at the time, Tocqueville would say, right? For these associations to play a positive role and actually enrich our democracy, you need to have a setting in which people can disagree, people can enter in and out of the group voluntarily, and once they join, they're not expected to simply obey the rules and listen to the leadership. So he sees a lot in the United States that concerns him. He sees a lot that he finds problematic, but particularly in our associational life, in the ways in which civil society operates in the United States, he sees a model that, for all of its faults, for all of the things that Tocqueville thinks is all the things that he thinks are wrong with the United States, he sees an associational model and a political culture that might be able to provide a good basis, a good foundation for democracy. So it's worth thinking about whether or not he gets it right? He's making certain claims about the character of early American society that I think there's a historical challenge to. Some of the things that he's observing in the 19th century, particularly with regard to social mobility and the relative equality of individuals within American society, I think we could take a look at today. We could look at some of the stratification that has grown into our society and our economic system and question that. And we could ask ourselves whether or not these insights that were made in the 19th century are still useful or they're out of date. That's something just to think about. So to shift gears now and talk about this piece you read by Horace Mann, he's dealing with some of the same challenges, some of the same questions as Tocqueville, and doing so in roughly the same time period, roughly the same sort of society that he's grappling with, a little bit later than Tocqueville, but still some of the same questions that are emerging. I think what's interesting with Horace Mann is that, like Tocqueville, he's really ambivalent about liberty. He is not one of these people that is, liberty is an end unto itself. Freedom is an end unto itself. It's something good no matter how we construct it. He thinks that liberty can either unleash the best in human beings or it can unleash the worst. He thinks that liberty, freedom, creates either creative, thoughtful human beings or it creates these wicked, selfish, violent monsters. And in his society, like in 19th century America and largely in New England. That was where he lived. He saw both. He saw, the power of freedom to enrich people's lives and make them really remarkable human beings that they couldn't be in a more authoritarian and controlled society. But he also sees, this kind of growing business class that is incredibly self-interested and not really very scrupulous, not driven by any sort of moral or ethical compass. So he's seeing both at work. There's an element of kind of Yankee Puritanism in Horace Mann. There's some of the things that he's saying are just warmed over versions of things that we were hearing from the Puritans and the Pilgrims. But he's tapping into an important sentiment in 19th century about the double-edged sword that is liberty. He rejects the notion that money or the existence of powerful economic interests is a problem. It's not a problem in and of itself. So there were some that were looking at the rise of the industrial United States, and they were saying, this is just deeply problematic. Individuals shouldn't be able to acquire this degree of wealth. And Mann is saying, no, that's actually not the problem. The problem is how individuals choose to utilize their wealth and how powerful economic interests choose to act. And that ultimately will be conditioned by their education. And so everything for him, every way of making sure that liberty unleashes the best in human beings and not the worst, gets tied back to education. He thinks that education is the basis for sound, stable democratic institutions that will hold up over time. He thinks it's the basis for prosperity and happiness. And he also thinks it's the basis by which each one of us takes our self-interest and our passion and the things that we want for ourselves or our narrow band of people that we care about, perhaps our families and our friends, and it keeps them in check. We don't attempt to defraud or manipulate or, otherwise imperil society to achieve our own self-interest. He writes, if these institutions quicken the activity, enlarge the sphere of appetites and passions, they must, at least in equal ration, establish the authority and extend the jurisdiction of reason and conscience. In a word, we must not add to the impulsive without also adding to the regulating forces. He was seeking a balance, right? He recognized that liberty was going to unleash certain impulses in us, but we needed to unleash also counteracting impulses through education, whereby people would restrain themselves, engage in self-restraint. It wasn't simply that the government had to tell people what they could and could not think or could and could not do. We could find a way in which people internally arrive at those understandings through education. So liberty without education, from the point of view of Mann, is two things. One, it's wasteful, because if we have freedom but we don't have education, then we can't truly harness and utilize our powers as citizens. And it's also dangerous. Ultimately, democracy puts power in the hands of the masses, and this is coercive power, right? This is power. This is the ability to use violence. This is the ability to imprison people, to take certain identities, certain modes of action, certain ways of thinking, and throw those people in jail to make their activities illegal, to make their existence illegal. And he thinks that if the masses are ignorant, then ultimately we're just turning over the reins to individuals who are going to put us at risk, right? They're going to put themselves at risk. They're going to put the society at risk. And so liberty without education, without something to refine our impulses, is incredibly dangerous. So he thinks that if democracy is going to endure and be meaningful, we have to have a state-supported system of education available to all citizens. And so he was one of the first to call for essentially what we have today, a publicly funded option to get a basic education that the majority of individuals in the United States take advantage of. Prior to this, there were an array of different perspectives on how education ought to be provided, and many thought that education was something that was private. It was a commodity that individuals would pay for, and the vast majority of people would not benefit from education. There were certain individuals that, you could try to teach them anything you wanted, but you were wasting your time. And Mann was much more egalitarian than that. He thought that, no, we needed to educate everyone. and broaden the scope to include, all of these individuals. And so he framed education as a right, but he framed it as an instrumental right. It wasn't just education for the sake of education. It was education because the political system that we have, democracy, depends upon it. If we don't enlarge the scope of what people are learning and what they're thinking, then our political institutions will fail. And that's a pretty remarkable idea. And ultimately, he was successful, right? Ultimately, he went over to Germany. He examined their political system, but also their education system. And he came back with ideas about how we ought to institute public education in the United States. Those ideas first took root in New England, specifically in Massachusetts, and then eventually spread to the entire United States, to the point where now it is taken for granted, you don't have to argue, that everybody ought to have access to a basic education. And really one of the foremost thinkers and proponents of that idea was framing that in relation to democracy. So for next time, you're going to be reading things that are much more contemporary than Rousseau, Tocqueville, or Mann. You're going to be reading about the role of civic associations and associational life in relation to contemporary democracy. You have this one piece by Putnam about social capital. You've probably encountered the word social capital at some point in your college career. And then you have a couple additional pieces by Courtwright and Davison. We're talking about social capital and what happens in the absence of social capital. So I want you to think about, one, what is social capital and what is its importance for our democratic system? And then also, what effects do we see in its absence? So if we don't have social capital, or if we have low levels of social capital, what are the political effects that are unleashed by that? And so we'll pick up there next time. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking about this more with you.